scripture for this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke, the 24th chapter, beginning with the first verse. But on the first day of the week, and at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. This reveals to us the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
One Sunday morning, back when I was serving as the senior pastor of the United Methodist Church out in Guyman, I was walking through the children's area of that church just as Sunday school was letting out. And out of a classroom came a little boy. His mother was waiting there just outside the door for him, and when the little guy saw her, he just nearly burst with excitement. "Mommy," he said, "guess what we talked about today in Sunday school? Angels." And the teacher showed us pictures of angels, and then we all made an angel to hang on our Christmas tree. See? And his mother took that ornament and she held it up and she looked at it and she said, "Oh, that is so beautiful. It will look really nice on our tree." Then the little guy's expression suddenly changed from excitement to a perplexed look as he asked his mother, "But Mama, don't men ever go to heaven?" "Well, of course they do, son," she replied. "Why in the world do you ask?" And the little guy responded, "Because I didn't see any pictures of angels with whiskers on their faces." And his mother answered, "Well, son, I'll tell you why that is. It's because most men who go to heaven only get there by a close shave." Now, that's probably true of all of us. We only share in the kingdom of heaven by the closest of shaves. After all, resurrection seems highly improbable, if not outright impossible. Think about it when the casket is lowered and the last spade of dirt is tossed upon the grave. Nobody expects the door of the tomb to ever open again. The women approaching the tomb that morning certainly didn't. Though Luke in his gospel, as he tells the Easter story, begins that story with the women just as they arrive at the tomb, in Mark's gospel, he begins the story a bit earlier. He tells us of a conversation that's taking place between the women as they are walking toward the tomb. And there's a question upon their lips. Who will be able to roll the stone for us from the door of the tomb? Do you hear it? That awful echo rumbling across the landscape. The sound of the tomb's door slammed shut. Jesus is entombed by death. We are entombed by grief, and we know we can't do anything about it. Who will be able to roll the stone from the door of the tomb? The door is shut. Our fate is sealed. That's what everybody thought. Caiaphas and Ananias, the rest of the Sanhedrin are dancing around, slapping each other with high fives, celebrating their victory. Pilate, Herod, the other Roman authorities are leaning back in their chairs, feet propped up, relaxing as they listen to the fat lady sing, confident the game is over. And the disciples have hidden themselves in fear's darkest corners, disappointed, defeated, despairing. Nobody, but nobody, is prepared for what the women are about to discover out at the cemetery that Easter morning. The door is open, the stone has been rolled away, the tomb is empty. And the voice cries out, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen." I mean, talk about your close shaves. Victory has been snatched out of the jaws of defeat. Life has been rescued from the claims of death. No one really expected God to answer the prayers of those women that day. Who will be able to roll the stone for us from the door of the tomb? But God answered. He always does. And He answered their prayer with resurrection, powerfully, eternally proclaiming, "I am opening the door of death's tomb." Now, as I think about Easter morning, I find myself wondering which is really the more surprising. The astonishing way that God answered their prayer, or the fact that everyone was amazed that God could, that God would open the door of the tomb. I mean, think about it. Isn't that exactly the way God has been answering prayers for even longer than anyone could remember? For instance, there was that tomb of death they called Egypt. The Hebrew people are locked in the oppression, the torture, the persecution of slavery. It is so bad that they are forced to throw their own babies into the Nile River and helplessly watch as they drown. Prayers of despair and heartache are spoken continuously in their tears of sorrow and grief. And God hears the prayers of His people. A baby is born, laid in a basket, hidden among the reeds of the Nile. Then by the closest of shaves, Pharaoh's own daughter rescues that baby, and she names him Moses. Later, as the story continues, there is the burning bush, then there are the 10 plagues, and the door of that Egyptian tomb is popped wide open. It's God gracing His people with new life. Years later, it happens once again. People are enslaved, entombed by a force of violent destruction. Many identify the power of Rome with its heavy taxation, its abusive treatment of individuals, its oppressive rules and regulations as the source of their painful wounds. On the other hand, the faithful say, Rome is only a symptom. The disease that is inflicting the hurt and the pain, the sorrow, the suffering is the decay of our moral fiber. It's the disintegration of our faith. It's our sin. But everyone's in agreement. This is not the way life ought to be. People shouldn't have to suffer from injustice. There's nothing fair about the hurting and the heartache. No one should have to live in constant fear of what the future will hold. This is just not right, not the way it was intended to be. And God heard their prayer. God saw their tears. A baby was born, laid in a manger. And even though evil reached out its iron hand to slam the door of the tomb shut, as Herod ordered that all the babies of Bethlehem were to be killed, just before the soldiers arrived to try to destroy God's plan of salvation, in the nick of time, by the closest of shaves, God opened the door, and Mary and Joseph escaped that region and took Jesus to Egypt. And years later, every time Jesus made it possible for a cripple to walk again, every time he reached out to give a blind person new sight, every time he approached someone who had made a real mess of their life and offered them his forgiveness, enabling them to enjoy a new beginning in life, God was opening the door, freeing them from what was entombing them. From telling Nicodemus, you must be born again, calling him from the tomb of spiritual death, to crying out, Lazarus, come forth, summoning him out of the tomb of physical death. Jesus, God in flesh, was answering prayers with resurrection's open door. That's what God has always been about, opening the door of tombs. So the women, the disciples, even the authorities probably shouldn't have been so surprised that Easter Sunday morning. You would think that they would have at least had some hint of the possibility of that stone being removed and the choruses of Christ the Lord is risen today floating upon the dawn's first rays of light and hope. But of course, we probably shouldn't be surprised by Easter's reality either. And yet we tend to be kind of fatalistic, negative, less than enthusiastic or hopeful. Yes, we tend to structure our life around thoughts and ideas like the secret to happiness is low expectations. A bad apple is bound to spoil the whole bushel. Anything that can go wrong will. And that statement by Benjamin Franklin, in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes. However, Easter contradicts the world's pessimism. With the stone removed and the empty tomb and the angel saying, why seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen. Easter proclaims God's promise. There is only one thing that is certain in this world. I am the God who hears your prayers, the God who opens tombs. Heather Whitestone has authored a book entitled Let God Surprise You, in which she encourages people to let God surprise them, even with what may seem to be the impossible. It's founded upon her personal experience of God freeing her from one of life's tombs. Heather wasn't born in that proverbial tomb, but when she was 18 months old, she received a tetanus shot. It was given for all the right reasons, given out of love, given in hopes of saving her from experiencing the hardships of serious illness. But for reasons no one anticipated nor fully understood, she had an adverse reaction to the shot, which led to a bacterial infection. And she ended up trapped in a tomb of silence. Totally deaf in one ear, 95% deaf in the other. When she was a little girl, her mother told her that first of all, she was a Christian and that she was also an American. And she pointed out to Heather that the last four letters of American are I-C-A-N, or I can. Throughout her growing up years, her mother kept saying to her over and over again, don't ever forget, honey, you can, you can, you can. With God's help, you can do anything you want to with the wonderful blessings that God has given you. So instead of growing up defeated and making excuses for why she couldn't do things, or simply feeling sorry for herself, agonizing over the unfairness of why she hadn't been given a better lot in life, she prayed and she trusted, and she worked faithfully to prepare herself to walk through whatever door God might be opening for her. She started taking dance lessons hoping that the rhythm of the movements would help her to learn to talk. When she was unable to keep up with her classwork and began to fall behind her peers, she asked her family to send her to a special school that would enable her to catch up with the other students in her class. While at Central Institute for the Deaf in St. Louis, Missouri, she advanced 2 grade levels per year. She mastered reading lips, and she learned sign language. After 3 years, she caught up with her peers, and she returned to Alabama, attended the Alabama School for Fine Arts for a year, and then graduated from Berry High School, now Hoover High School, in 1991. Her passion was ballet, and she was spent much of her time developing her ballet skills. She then went on to study at Jacksonville State University. Now, chances are, some of you, maybe many of you, will remember well what took place in Heather's life back on Saturday evening, September 17th of 1994. Against all odds, Heather Whitestone was crowned Miss America, the first, the only deaf Miss America. Back on that day, she captured the hearts of millions upon millions of people who were watching on national TV. As for her talent, she danced beautifully to a song that anticipates God's greatest surprise, grace. The grace of forgiveness, the grace of eternity, the grace of open tombs. The song she danced to is called the Via Dolorosa. Listen to the lyrics. Down the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem that day, the soldiers tried to clear the narrow streets, but the crowd pressed in to see the man condemned to die on Calvary. He was bleeding from the beating. There were stripes upon his back, and he wore a crown of thorns upon his head. He bore with every step the scorn of those who cried out for his death. Down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering, like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me, down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. The blood that would cleanse the souls of all men made its way through the heart of Jerusalem, down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering. Like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me, down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. Just as God surprised the world by transforming Jesus' suffering into an act of redemption, by the grace of God, the challenges that threatened to entomb Heather are now being used to redeem others who face similar challenges. As Heather has become a dynamic advocate for those who are hearing impaired, doing what she can to help them to fully realize their potential as children of God, working with God to free them from the tomb of disability. There's a scene in Mark Twain's The Adventure of Tom Sawyer that comes to my mind today. Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and Joe Harper have set forth on a raft down the Mississippi to be pirates. Everyone at home thought that they were lost and they were dead, so the town had a funeral for the three of them on Sunday morning. At Sunday school, all the people could talk about was the tragedy of these three lost boys. When the bell rang for Sunday school to be over, the people filed solemnly into the sanctuary for the funeral service. The preacher began talking about the three lads, stories so touching that the people felt pangs of guilt that they hadn't seen such good in these boys when they were alive, but had so often seen only their faults and flaws. Soon everyone was sobbing in grief. Then there was a rustling in the balcony, though no one really noticed, being so immersed in their grief. And in a few moments, the back door of the church opened. The minister, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, looked up and stood transformed. Here came Tom, then Joe, then Huck down the aisle. They'd come home and had been hiding up in the balcony observing their own funeral service. Well, as you might imagine, the congregation is shocked with delight. They rush to embrace the boys. Suddenly the minister shouts out, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Sing, put your hearts in it." But they don't need to be told to put their hearts in it. They sing as never before, and their voices lift the rafters. After all, the door has popped open, and they've discovered that death's tomb is empty. Today, as you and I celebrate the Easter story, it's as though we are up in the balcony with Jesus, looking at the women and the disciples, and the world for that matter, as they do their funeral thing for the Jesus they think is locked in death's dark tomb. And Jesus whispers to us, "You're going to love this part." God has a real surprise in store for them. Just watch what they're going to discover when they get to that tomb. Now, I don't know what tomb that you might be looking at today. We all know too well. There's a lot of tombs in this world of ours. Disappointment, despair, fear, failure, loss, loneliness, ridicule, rejection, illness, estrangement, addiction, anxiety, divorce, discouragement, anger, bitterness, low self-esteem, life without meaning, financial worries, spiritual drought, tombs, too numerous to name, all destructive and deadly, shut tight by doors too heavy for us to overcome. No, I don't know which tomb is yours, but this I believe with all my being. God hears your cry. And on this morning, Jesus has a smile on his face, and if you'll listen through the ears of God's Easter people, you'll hear our Savior whisper, "It may seem like a close shave to you, but you're going to love this part. Just watch. God is about to surprise you. You're about to see the door of that tomb pop wide open."